Emperor Zethkalar stood on the balcony of his crystal palace, looking out at the stars he had conquered. His black scales caught the light from 3 suns as he watched ships move between the planets of his empire. For 300 years, dragons had ruled the galaxy. They were stronger, smarter, and lived longer than any other race. At least that was what every dragon believed. The emperor turned away from the window and walked through the halls of his palace. His claws clicked on the crystal floor as he moved past golden statues and priceless art, taken from 1,000 conquered worlds. Guards bowed as he passed, their own scales gleaming in different colors: red, blue, green, and silver. All of them were perfect examples of dragon strength and pride. But Zethkalar was not thinking about his empire or his victories. He was thinking about his greatest shame, hidden away in the highest tower of the palace where no one could see: his son. Prince Kael'thas was 50 years old, still young for a dragon. By now he should have been learning to fight, to lead armies, to inspire fear in lesser races. Instead, he spent his days rocking back and forth, covering his ears when sounds became too loud and refusing to look anyone in the eyes. The emperor had tried everything. He brought the best dragon healers from across the empire. They examined the prince with their ancient magic and powerful minds. They all said the same thing: the prince was broken. His mind did not work the way a dragon mind should work. Some suggested that the kindest thing would be to end his life quickly, to spare the royal family further shame. Zethkalar could not do that. Despite everything, Kael'thas was still his son, so instead he hid him away. The prince lived in the North Tower, far from the main palace. Only a few trusted servants knew he existed. The emperor told his court that the prince was studying in a distant part of the empire. He told himself that someday, somehow, his son might get better. The servants who cared for Prince Kael'thas were carefully chosen. They had to be quiet, patient, and above all, they had to keep the secret. Most were dragons from the lower classes who needed the work and would not dare to speak against the royal family. But there was one human, Claire. Bennett had been captured 3 years ago when the dragons attacked the human colony of New Haven. She was 28 years old, with brown hair and calm gray eyes. Unlike most humans who shook with fear around dragons, Claire seemed oddly at peace. She did her work without complaint and never tried to run away. The head servant had chosen her because humans were considered the lowest of all races. They were weak, lived short lives, and were good only for simple tasks. If the secret of the prince's condition ever got out, no one would believe a human anyway. Claire worked in the tower every day. She brought food, cleaned the rooms, and made sure the prince had everything he needed. At first, she simply did her job and nothing more. But as days turned into weeks, she began to notice things. She noticed that Prince Kael'thas always sat in the same corner of his room. She noticed that he moved his hands in the same patterns over and over. She noticed that loud noises made him cover his ears and curl up into a ball. She noticed that bright lights made him close his eyes and turn away. Most importantly, she noticed that the other servants thought these behaviors were signs of madness. They would try to force the prince to sit in different places, to stop moving his hands, to look at them when they spoke. This always made things worse. The prince would become upset, sometimes hitting himself or crying until he could not breathe. Claire had seen this before, though she could not tell anyone. Before the dragon invasion, she had worked as a teacher on New Haven. Some of her students had acted just like Prince Kael'thas. They were not broken or mad. Their minds simply worked differently than other people. On Earth, humans had learned to help people like this. They had special schools, special methods, and most importantly, they understood that being different was not the same as being wrong. But Claire was just a human servant in a dragon palace. No one would listen to her ideas even if she could find a way to explain them, so she watched and waited, and slowly began to make small changes that no one else would notice. When she brought the prince his food, she always approached from the same direction. She kept her movements slow and quiet. She never tried to force him to look at her or speak to her. Instead, she would simply place the food where he could reach it and step back. After a few weeks, something wonderful happened. Prince Kael'thas began to eat more. He stopped throwing his food across the room or refusing to touch it. He even began to glance at Claire from the corner of his eye when she entered the room. The other servants were amazed. They had been trying to force the prince to behave properly for months with no success. But they did not understand why Claire's approach worked, and Claire could not explain it to them. One day, Emperor Zethkalar decided to visit his son. He had not seen Kael'thas in several months, and his guilt was becoming too heavy to bear. He climbed the long stairs to the North Tower, his heart growing heavier with each step. He expected to find his son in the same condition as always, rocking in his corner, lost in his own strange world, a disappointment to the proud dragon race. Instead, he found something impossible. Prince Kael'thas was sitting calmly at a table with the human servant. They were not talking, but they were arranging small colored crystals in patterns on the table surface. The prince was humming softly, a sound the emperor had never heard him make before. His eyes, usually darting around the room in panic, were focused and calm. Claire noticed the emperor's presence first. She stood quickly and bowed, as all servants were required to do. But she did not move away from the table or try to hide what they had been doing. Prince Kael'thas looked up at his father for just a moment, the first time he had made eye contact in years, then returned to his crystals. But he continued humming, and he did not seem upset or afraid. Emperor Zethkalar stared at the scene before him. His son looked peaceful, happy even. For the first time in 50 years, Kael'thas seemed content with his life, and it was all because of a human. The emperor's world tilted on its axis. Everything he believed about dragon superiority, about the weakness of other races, about his son's hopeless condition, it all began to crack like ice in the spring sun. He left the tower without saying a word, but his mind was racing. How could this be possible? How could a human succeed where the greatest dragon minds had failed? As he walked back to his throne room, Emperor Zethkalar felt something he had not experienced in decades: hope. And with that hope came the first stirrings of a question that would change everything. What if everything he believed was wrong? Claire Bennett had not always been a servant in a dragon palace. 3 years ago, she had been a teacher at New Haven Elementary School, working with children who learned differently than others. She had loved her job and had been good at it. Her students trusted her, their parents respected her, and she felt like she was making a real difference in young lives. All of that ended the day the dragons came. The attack happened without warning. Massive ships blotted out the sun, and creatures the size of buildings descended from the sky breathing fire. The human military tried to fight back, but their weapons were useless against dragon scales and dragon magic. In less than a week, New Haven was conquered. Most of the colonists were killed in the fighting. The survivors were sorted into groups, the strong ones for heavy labor, the smart ones for technical work, and the rest for whatever tasks the dragons needed done. Claire found herself in the third group, assigned to work as a servant in the palace of the Dragon Emperor himself. She had expected to die. She had expected torture or worse. Instead, she found herself mopping floors and serving food to dragon nobles who barely noticed she existed. It was not the life she had planned, but it was still life. Everything changed when she was assigned to work in the North Tower. The other servants whispered about the prince who lived there. They said he was mad, dangerous, touched by evil spirits. They said the emperor kept him locked away to protect the empire from his madness. They said terrible things would happen to anyone who upset him. But when Claire first saw Prince Kael'thas, she did not see madness or danger. She saw a young person who was overwhelmed by a world that did not understand him. The prince was sitting in the corner of his room, rocking back and forth while making soft humming sounds. His eyes darted around the room, never focusing on any one thing for long. His hands moved in repeating patterns, touching his fingers to his thumbs in the same order over and over again. Claire recognized these behaviors immediately. On Earth, she would have said the prince was autistic. But she was not on Earth anymore, and she could not use human words to describe what she saw. The other servants tried to treat Prince Kael'thas like any other dragon noble. They expected him to sit still, to make eye contact, to respond to their questions with proper royal dignity. When he did not, they became frustrated and tried to force him to behave correctly. Claire watched them make mistake after mistake. They would grab the prince's hands to stop his repetitive movements, which only made him more upset. They would speak loudly to get his attention, which made him cover his ears and curl into a ball. They would turn up the lights in his room so he could see better, which made him hide his face and refuse to come out. Each failed attempt to help made Prince Kael'thas more withdrawn and fearful. By the time Claire arrived, he had stopped eating regularly and would sometimes hurt himself by hitting his head against the walls. Claire knew she had to be careful. She was just a human servant with no authority and no voice. If she did something wrong, she could be killed without question. But she also could not stand by and watch someone suffer when she knew how to help. She started with small changes that no one else would notice. Instead of trying to make Prince Caelthus look at her, she would simply place his food within reach and step back. Instead of speaking to him directly, she would hum softly while she worked, giving him time to get used to her presence. Instead of trying to stop his hand movements, she would leave small objects on his table that he could arrange and rearrange as much as he wanted. Most importantly, she paid attention to what upset him and what calmed him down. She noticed that the prince became agitated when too many people were in his room at once. So she began timing her visits for when the other servants were busy elsewhere. She noticed that sudden loud noises made him panic, so she moved slowly and quietly, warning him with soft sounds before she entered the room. She noticed that bright lights hurt his eyes, so she found reasons to close the curtains during the brightest part of the day, telling the other servants that the prince needed rest. Slowly, very slowly, Prince Caelthus began to relax around her. It took weeks before he would eat while she was in the room. It took longer before he would glance in her direction, but each small step forward gave Claire hope that she was on the right path. The breakthrough came when she brought him a collection of colored crystals from the palace. Garden Claire had noticed that the prince liked to arrange objects in patterns. She had seen him line up his eating utensils in perfect rows, or stack his books in precise towers. She thought he might enjoy having more objects to work with. She was right. The moment Prince Caelthus saw the crystals, his eyes lit up with an interest Claire had never seen before. He reached for them carefully, turning each one over in his hands before placing it on the table. Soon he was creating complex patterns with the crystals, changing them, rebuilding them, lost in focused concentration. For the first time since Claire had known him, the prince looked truly happy. From that day forward, Claire brought him new objects to arrange: smooth stones from the river, pieces of colored glass, even flower petals that he could sort by color and size. Each new addition to his collection seemed to calm him more. She also began to understand his sounds and movements. The humming meant he was content. The hand movements helped him think. The rocking soothed him when he felt overwhelmed. None of these behaviors were signs of madness. They were tools he used to cope with a world that was too bright, too loud, and too unpredictable. Claire started making more changes to help him. She convinced the other servants that the prince needed quiet time to think important royal thoughts, which gave him periods of solitude every day. She rearranged his furniture so he always had a quiet corner to retreat to when visitors came. She even managed to get softer lighting in his room by claiming that the harsh crystals were giving him headaches. Each change made Prince Caelthus more comfortable, and as he became more comfortable, he became more willing to interact with the world around him. He began eating his meals at regular times. He stopped hitting himself when he became upset. He even started responding to Claire's presence with small nods or glances that showed he was aware of her and glad she was there. But the most amazing change was that he began to communicate. It started with simple gestures. He would point to crystals he wanted, or touch Claire's hand when he wanted her attention. Then he began copying her humming, creating his own melodies that seemed to express his moods. Claire realized that Prince Caelthus was not unable to communicate. He had simply never been given ways to communicate that worked for him. She began teaching him simple hand signals, things she had learned working with nonverbal students on Earth. She would point to herself and say, "Claire," then point to him and wait for a response. It took many tries, but eventually he pointed to himself and made a sound that she understood meant his name. From there, they developed their own language of gestures, sounds, and crystal arrangements. It was not the formal dragon speech that his tutors had tried to force him to learn, but it worked for them. Claire learned that the prince was much smarter than anyone realized. He could solve complex puzzles with his crystal patterns. He could predict weather changes by observing tiny details that others missed. He had an amazing memory for facts and could recite entire books after hearing them only once. His mind was not broken. It was just different. As weeks turned into months, Prince Caelthus bloomed under Claire's patient care. He smiled more often. He explored his room instead of hiding in one corner. He even began showing interest in things happening outside his tower. Claire felt proud of their progress, but she also felt sad. She knew that what she was doing with the prince was nothing special by human standards. On Earth, there were thousands of teachers, doctors, and therapists who helped people like Keltis every day. But in the Dragon Empire, he was seen as hopeless simply because no one understood how his mind worked. She wondered how many other people across the galaxy were suffering because their differences were seen as defects instead of just different ways of being. She was thinking about this one afternoon when something unexpected happened. Prince Keltis was working on a particularly complex crystal pattern when he suddenly looked up toward the door. A moment later, Claire heard footsteps on the stairs, heavy footsteps that belonged to someone much larger than the usual servants. Emperor Zethkalar appeared in the doorway, his massive form filling the entrance. Claire's heart nearly stopped. She had never seen the Emperor this close before, and his presence was overwhelming. She started to bow, as all servants were required to do. But something stopped her. Prince Keltis had looked directly at his father, the first eye contact Claire had ever seen him make with anyone. And he had not stopped working on his crystal pattern. The prince glanced at his father, then at Claire, then back at his crystals. He made a soft humming sound that Claire recognized as his happy sound. Then he did something that shocked them both. He gestured for his father to come closer and look at what he had created. Emperor Zethkalar stood frozen in the doorway, staring at his son with an expression Claire could not read. The prince waited patiently, still, humming, still arranging his crystals, but clearly wanting to share his work with his father. For the first time in 50 years, Prince Emperor Zethkalar could not sleep that night. He lay on his massive bed of gold and precious stones, staring at the ceiling while his mind raced with questions that had no easy answers. For 50 years, he had believed his son was broken beyond repair. The greatest dragon healers in the Empire had examined Prince Keltis and declared him hopeless. They had used ancient magic to probe his mind and found only chaos where there should have been order. They had recommended treatments that made the prince worse, not better. But a human servant had succeeded where they all failed. The Emperor had spent hours after leaving the tower trying to understand what he had witnessed. His son had been calm, focused, even happy. Keltis had made eye contact for the first time in decades. He had tried to share his crystal patterns, as if they meant something important to him. Most shocking of all, the prince had hummed while his father watched, a sound of contentment that Zethkalar had never heard before. How was it possible that a human could understand his son when dragons could not? The next morning, the Emperor made a decision that would have horrified his court if they had known about it. Instead of attending his usual meetings with generals and governors, he returned to the North Tower. But this time he did not announce his presence. Instead, he used a secret passage that allowed him to observe without being seen. He watched as Claire entered Prince Keltis' room with the morning meal. She moved slowly and quietly, placing the food on the table without trying to force the prince to acknowledge her. She hummed softly while she worked, the same melody the prince had been using the day before. Keltis looked up when she entered, not with the frightened glances he usually gave to visitors, but with what could only be described as recognition and pleasure. He pointed to his crystal arrangements from the previous day, which were still on the table, and made sounds that seemed to be telling Claire about them. Claire responded as if she understood perfectly. She nodded and made encouraging sounds while the prince showed her different parts of his pattern. She even added a few crystals of her own, which made Keltis clap his hands with delight. The Emperor watched in amazement as his son and the human servant communicated without using any formal language. They had created their own way of talking, using gestures, sounds, and shared activities that both of them understood. But what shocked Zethkalar most was how smart his son appeared to be when he was allowed to communicate in his own way. The crystal patterns were not random decorations. They were complex mathematical sequences that would have challenged trained dragon scholars. Keltis was showing Claire how changing one element affected the entire design, demonstrating an understanding of pattern and logic that no one had ever suspected he possessed. For 3 hours, the Emperor watched this incredible interaction. He saw his son laugh for the first time. He saw him solve problems with ease. He saw him express ideas and emotions that formal dragon language had never allowed him to share, and he realized that every dragon expert who had examined his son had been completely wrong. Kael'thas was not broken. He was brilliant. His mind simply worked differently than other dragons expected it to work. That afternoon, Emperor Zethkalar did something unprecedented. He summoned Claire to his private study. Claire had never been in the main palace before. She walked through halls filled with treasures from 1,000 conquered worlds, past guards who stared at her in surprise, to the Emperor's personal chambers. She was terrified, certain that she had done something wrong and was about to be punished. The Emperor's study was enormous, with walls covered in books and star charts. Zethkalar himself sat behind a desk carved from a single massive diamond, his black scales gleaming in the light from crystal windows. When Claire entered, he gestured for her to sit in a chair across from him. "You are not in trouble," he said, noticing her fear. "I want to ask you about my son." Claire sat carefully on the edge of the chair, which was sized for dragons and far too large for her. She nodded but said nothing, unsure what was expected of her. "The healers tell me Prince Kael'thas is mad," the Emperor continued. "They say his mind is broken and cannot be fixed. But I have seen him with you and he does not seem mad. He seems different. Explain this to me." Claire took a deep breath. This was the moment she had both hoped for and feared. She could tell the Emperor what she really thought, but if he disagreed with her, she could be killed for questioning dragon wisdom. "Your Majesty," she began carefully, "I do not think the prince is mad. I think his mind works differently than other minds, but that does not make it broken." The Emperor leaned forward, his enormous eyes fixed on her face. "Continue." "Where I come from," Claire said, "we have people whose minds work like Prince Kael'thas' mind works. They have trouble with loud noises and bright lights. They do not like to look directly at people. They move their hands and bodies in ways that help them think. But they are not mad or broken. They just need different kinds of help than other people need." "And you know how to provide this help?" Zethkalar asked. "Some of it, yes. I worked with children like this before I came here." The Emperor was quiet for a long moment, thinking about what Claire had told him. Finally, he spoke again. "Show me," he said. "Teach me what you know about my son." For the next several hours, Claire tried to explain autism to a dragon emperor. She did not use the human word because she knew he would not understand it. Instead, she described how some minds needed quiet spaces, predictable routines, and communication methods that did not rely on eye contact or formal speech. She told him about the crystal patterns and how they helped Kael'thas organize his thoughts. She explained why forcing him to behave like other dragons made him upset and afraid. She described the progress he had made when she stopped trying to change him and started trying to understand him instead. Emperor Zethkalar listened to every word. Sometimes he asked questions that showed he was beginning to understand. Sometimes he looked angry, but Claire realized he was not angry at her. He was angry at all the years his son had suffered because no one knew how to help him properly. "If what you say is true," the Emperor said finally, "then every healer who examined my son was wrong. Every expert who declared him hopeless was mistaken. The greatest minds in my empire failed to understand something that a human servant figured out in a few weeks." Claire nodded, then realized that might seem disrespectful. "I am sorry, Your Majesty. I did not mean to suggest that dragon healers are not wise. I only know about this one thing because I learned about it before." But Zethkalar was not offended. Instead, he looked thoughtful and perhaps a little sad. "You have nothing to apologize for," he said. "If anyone should apologize, it is me. I should have looked harder for ways to help my son instead of hiding him away in shame." The Emperor stood up and walked to one of his windows, looking out at the city below. When he spoke again, his voice was quiet. "I have ruled this empire for 3 centuries, he said. "I have conquered planets and commanded the loyalty of billions. But I could not help my own son feel safe and happy in his own home. You did that in a few months with nothing but patience and understanding." He turned back to Claire, and she was surprised to see something like respect in his ancient eyes. "I want you to continue working with Prince Kael'thas," he said, "but not as a servant. I am promoting you to the position of royal tutor. You will have authority over his care and education. You will teach him using methods that work for his mind, not methods that work for other dragons." Claire felt dizzy with shock. She had expected punishment, not promotion. "Your Majesty, I am honored, but the other dragons will not accept a human in such a position." "The other dragons do not need to accept it," Zethkalar said firmly. "I am the Emperor. My word is law, and my word is that you know more about helping my son than anyone else in this empire." He paused, then added something that changed everything. "I want to learn what you know. Teach me how to understand my son the way you understand him. Show me how to be the father he needs instead of the father I thought he should have." For the first time since the dragons had conquered her world, Claire felt hope. Not just hope for herself, but hope for Prince Caelthus, and maybe even hope for other people whose differences made them outcasts in dragon society. "Yes, Your Majesty," she said. "I will teach you everything I can." As Claire left the Emperor's study with her new status as royal tutor, she did not know that she had just started a revolution. Word of her promotion spread quickly through the palace, causing shock, outrage, and confusion among the dragon nobles. A human had been given authority over a dragon prince. A member of an inferior race was now making decisions about royal education. It was unthinkable, unprecedented, and absolutely certain to cause trouble. But in the North Tower, Prince Caelthus continued arranging his crystals and humming his melodies, unaware that his life was about to change in ways he could never have imagined. For the first time in 50 years, he was going to have a father who understood him, and that changed everything. The dragon court was in chaos. News of Claire's promotion to royal tutor had spread through the palace like fire through dry grass. Dragon nobles who had served the empire for centuries could not believe what they were hearing. A human, a member of the weakest, most inferior race in the galaxy, had been given authority over a dragon prince. Lord Commander Vexrath, the Emperor's chief military advisor, was the first to voice what many were thinking. "This is madness, Your Majesty," he said during the morning council session. His red scales gleamed with anger as he spoke. "You cannot seriously intend to let a human teach Prince Caelthus. What could such a creature possibly know about dragon nobility and royal duties?" Emperor Zethkalar sat on his throne of black crystal, listening to the complaints that filled his court. Every noble had something to say about his decision. They spoke of tradition, of dragon superiority, of the shame that would fall on the royal family if word of this spread to other worlds. "The prince needs proper dragon tutors," insisted Lady Morthana, her blue scales shimmering with indignation. "Healers who understand dragon minds and dragon ways, not some human who fills his head with alien nonsense." "What will the other races think?" added Duke Turgon. "If we show weakness by elevating humans to positions of authority, every conquered world will see it as a sign that dragon rule is failing." The Emperor listened to these arguments for hours without speaking. Finally, when the last noble had finished complaining, he stood up from his throne. The entire court fell silent. "You speak of dragon superiority," Zethkalar said, his voice carrying easily through the vast throne room. "You tell me that dragons are smarter, stronger, and more capable than any other race. Is this not what we have always believed?" The nobles nodded eagerly, thinking the Emperor was about to come to his senses. "Then explain to me," the Emperor continued, "how the greatest dragon healers in my empire failed to help my son, while one human succeeded in a matter of weeks." The court erupted in protests and explanations. Some nobles claimed that the human must be using magic or trickery. Others suggested that Prince Caelthus was not really improved, just temporarily distracted. A few whispered that perhaps the prince had been cursed by human witchcraft and that Claire was part of some elaborate plot. "Emperor," Zethkalar raised one massive claw for silence. "I have seen my son laugh," he said quietly. "For the first time in 50 years, I have seen him happy and at peace. I have watched him solve complex problems and communicate ideas that none of us knew he possessed. This happened not because of dragon healing or dragon wisdom, but because one human took the time to understand how his mind works." Lord Commander Vexrath stepped forward, his military bearing stiff with disapproval. "Your Majesty, with respect, you are allowing emotion to cloud your judgment. One positive interaction does not prove that this human understands anything meaningful about dragon psychology. The prince may simply be responding to novelty. It will not last." "Then you will not mind if I continue the experiment," the Emperor replied calmly. "If you are correct, the human's methods will fail within a few weeks, and we can return to the old ways. If you are wrong—" He left the sentence unfinished, but the implication was clear. If the dragon nobles were wrong about human inferiority, then everything they believed about dragon superiority might also be wrong. The argument might have continued for hours, but it was interrupted by an unexpected visitor. Prince Kael'thas entered the throne room. No one had seen the prince in public for decades. He had not attended court functions, state dinners, or any royal ceremonies since he was a small child. His appearance now caused every dragon in the room to fall silent with shock. Kael'thas walked slowly but steadily across the vast floor, with Claire at his side. He did not make eye contact with the assembled nobles, but he did not seem frightened or overwhelmed either. He moved with purpose, as if he had come here for a specific reason. He approached his father's throne and stopped. For a moment he stood quietly, his hands moving in the small repetitive patterns that helped him think. Then he reached into a bag he carried and pulled out a collection of crystals arranged on a flat board. The crystal arrangement was extraordinarily complex. It incorporated mathematical principles that would have challenged trained scholars, but more than that, it was beautiful. The patterns seemed to flow and dance even though the crystals were perfectly still. Prince Kael'thas held up his creation for his father to see. Then in a voice that was soft but clear enough for everyone in the throne room to hear, he spoke. "For you," he said simply. It was the first time anyone except Claire had heard the prince speak in 30 years. Emperor Zeth-Kalar took the crystal board with hands that trembled slightly. He stared at his son's gift, understanding for the first time that the patterns were not random arrangements but a form of art and communication that came from a brilliant mind working in its own unique way. "Thank you," he said, his voice thick with emotion. "It is beautiful." Prince Kael'thas nodded once, then turned and left the throne room with Claire. He had said what he came to say and done what he came to do. The political arguments of the court were not his concern, but his brief appearance had accomplished something that hours of debate could not. Every noble in the room had seen the prince calm, focused, and capable. They had heard him speak with clarity and purpose. They had witnessed him create something that demonstrated intelligence and creativity beyond anything they had imagined him capable of. The evidence was impossible to deny. Whatever Claire was doing with Prince Kael'thas was working. Lord Commander Vexrath was the first to recover from his shock. "The prince has indeed improved," he admitted reluctantly. "But this does not change the fact that elevating a human to such a position sets a dangerous precedent. What happens when other conquered races demand similar treatment? How do we maintain order if we admit that humans can be our equals in any capacity?" It was a fair question, and one that cut to the heart of the Empire's structure. Dragon rule was based on the belief that dragons were naturally superior to all other races. If that belief was wrong, then the entire foundation of the Empire was built on a lie. Emperor Zeth-Kalar considered this carefully. He understood that his decision about Claire and his son would have consequences far beyond the palace walls. But he also understood that truth was more important than comfortable lies. "Perhaps," he said slowly, "it is time we questioned whether our beliefs about racial superiority are as accurate as we have always assumed." The court erupted in shocked protests, but the emperor continued speaking. "For 3 centuries we have ruled this galaxy by force, believing that our strength gave us the right to dominate others. But strength alone does not make us wise. It does not make us just, and it clearly does not make us all-knowing." He gestured to the crystal board that his son had given him. "This was created by a mind that our greatest experts declared hopeless. It was made possible by insights from a race we consider inferior. If we can be so wrong about something so close to home, what else might we be wrong about?" Duke Tergon stepped forward, his green scales pale with concern. "Your Majesty, you speak of questioning our entire way of life. The Empire was built on dragon superiority. If we abandon that principle, what holds us together? What prevents every conquered world from rebelling?" "Maybe," the Emperor said quietly, "we should ask ourselves why they would want to rebel in the first place." The throne room fell silent. What the Emperor was suggesting was revolutionary beyond anything the court could have imagined. He was not just promoting one human to help his son. He was questioning the fundamental assumptions that held their civilization together. Some nobles looked horrified. Others looked thoughtful. A few looked intrigued, as if they had been waiting their entire lives for someone to ask these questions. Emperor Zeth-Kalar stood up from his throne, making his final decision. "Claire Bennett will continue as royal tutor to Prince Kael'thas," he announced. "Furthermore, I am establishing a new position, advisor on alternative perspectives. She will study how other races approach problems that we have been unable to solve. She will have full access to our libraries, our records, and our research facilities. The protest began immediately, but the Emperor held up one claw for silence. I am also ordering a comprehensive review of our policies toward all conquered races. We will examine whether our current methods of rule are truly the most effective, or whether we have been limiting ourselves by refusing to learn from others. Lord Commander Vexrath's voice was tight with barely controlled anger. Your Majesty, this path leads to the destruction of everything our ancestors built. You are asking us to abandon 3 centuries of dragon dominance for the untested ideas of inferior races. No, Emperor Zethkalar replied firmly. I am asking us to become truly superior by being wise enough to learn from anyone who has something valuable to teach us. My son has shown me that different does not mean inferior. It simply means different. And sometimes different perspectives can solve problems that traditional approaches cannot. The Emperor looked around his court, meeting the eyes of nobles who had served his family for generations. Those who cannot accept this new direction are free to request reassignment to distant parts of the empire, he said. I will not force. 2 years had passed since Claire Bennett became royal tutor to Prince Kael'thas, and the Dragon Empire was transforming in ways that no one could have predicted. The changes started small. Claire's methods for helping the prince spread to other members of the royal household who had similar needs. A young dragon servant who had always been considered slow and clumsy turned out to have exceptional abilities when given tasks that matched his particular way of thinking. A kitchen worker who could barely speak in formal dragon language proved to be a mathematical genius who could optimize food distribution across the entire palace. Complex word of these successes reached other parts of the empire. Governors and military commanders began requesting human advisors to help them understand the non-dragon populations under their rule. They discovered that many problems they had struggled with for decades could be solved by simply asking the affected people what they needed instead of assuming what was best for them. Emperor Zethkalar established the Institute for Alternative Perspectives on the Capital World. With Claire as its first director, the Institute studied different approaches to education, medicine, engineering, and governance from across the galaxy. What they learned challenged everything the dragons thought they knew about effective leadership, but not everyone was happy with these changes. Lord Commander Vexrath had requested reassignment to the Outer Rim territories rather than serve under the new policies. Before leaving, he had spoken privately with several other noble families who shared his concerns about the Empire's new direction. The Emperor has lost his way, Vexrath told them. He elevates inferior races and listens to their alien ideas instead of trusting in dragon wisdom. If this continues, we will lose everything our ancestors fought to build. These conversations led to secret meetings, and secret meetings led to plans. A group of traditional nobles decided that the only way to save the empire was to remove Emperor Zethkalar from power and return to the old ways of absolute dragon supremacy. The conspiracy might have succeeded if they had moved quickly. But they made the mistake of assuming that Prince Kael'thas was still the weak, helpless dragon he had been before Claire's arrival. They planned their coup for a day when the Emperor would be reviewing military exercises on a distant world. With the Emperor away and most of the loyal guards accompanying him, the rebels believed they could easily capture the prince and use him as a hostage to force Zethkalar to abdicate. What they did not expect was that Prince Kael'thas had grown far beyond the frightened, isolated young dragon they remembered. The prince was in his study with Claire when the rebels arrived at the palace. They brought a small army of soldiers who supported their cause, confident that they would face no real resistance. They were wrong. Prince Kael'thas had spent 2 years learning to understand the world around him in his own unique way. His attention to detail, his ability to see patterns that others missed, and his talent for solving complex problems had all grown stronger with Claire's patient teaching. When the rebels entered the palace, the prince immediately noticed that something was wrong. The guards were positioned differently than usual. The normal sounds of palace life were missing. Even the smell in the air was different because of the nervous sweat of the soldiers. Danger, he told Claire quietly, using the hand signals they had developed together. Claire trusted his instincts completely. She had learned that Kael'thas often noticed things that others missed. Together, they activated the palace's emergency communication system and sent a message to Emperor Zethkalar. Attack on palace. Need help. But they did not wait for rescue. Prince Kelthus had an idea. For months he had been studying the palace's security systems as part of his education. He knew every passage, every hidden door, and every weakness in the ancient building. More importantly, he understood how the rebels would think and move through the palace because he had observed similar patterns in his crystal arrangements. They will go to the throne room first, he told Claire, his voice calm despite the danger. Then to Father's private chambers, then here. We have maybe 20 minutes. Claire marveled at how far the prince had come. 2 years ago, the sound of unfamiliar people in the palace would have sent him into a panic. Now he was analyzing the situation like a military strategist. What do you want to do? She asked. Prince Kelthus smiled, an expression that would have been impossible before Claire came into his life. I want to show them that different does not mean weak, he said, using his detailed knowledge of the palace. Prince Kelthus led Claire through hidden passages to key points throughout the building. At each location, he made small changes that would seem harmless to casual observers, but would have significant effects on anyone trying to move through the palace. He adjusted the lighting controls so that certain corridors became very bright while others became very dim, making it difficult for the rebels to see clearly. He activated the palace's sound system, filling some rooms with soft music that would mask the sound of footsteps while leaving other areas completely silent, so that any noise would seem unnaturally loud. Most cleverly, he used his understanding of how people move through familiar spaces to predict exactly where the rebels would go and when they would arrive there. When Lord Commander Vexrath and his soldiers finally reached the prince's study, they found it empty. But as they searched the room, all the lights suddenly went out. In the darkness, they heard Prince Kelthus' voice coming from speakers hidden throughout the palace. Lord Commander Vexrath, the prince said, his words clear and strong. You have made a mistake. This palace is my home. I know every stone, every shadow, every sound. You are the ones who are lost here, not me. The rebels tried to follow the sound of his voice, but the prince was using the communication system to make it seem like he was in different places at different times. As they stumbled through darkened corridors, palace guards loyal to the emperor began arriving at strategic points, guided by messages from Prince Kelthus who could track the rebels' movements through the security systems. The coup collapsed within hours. The rebels found themselves surrounded, confused, and completely outmaneuvered by a prince they had dismissed as mentally defective. When Emperor Zethkalar returned to the palace, he found Lord Commander Vexrath and his conspirators in custody, captured through a brilliant tactical plan devised by his supposedly hopeless son. How? Was all Vexrath could say when he saw the emperor. My son is not broken, Zethkalar replied simply. He never was. He just needed someone who understood how his mind works, and his mind works very well indeed. The failed coup had an unexpected effect on the empire. News of Prince Kelthus' heroic defense of the palace spread quickly through the dragon military. Soldiers who had assumed the prince was weak and unfit to rule were amazed to learn that he had outsmarted experienced military commanders using nothing but intelligence and creativity. More importantly, the prince's actions proved that the emperor's new policies were not signs of weakness, but sources of strength. By accepting and nurturing differences instead of suppressing them, the empire was becoming more capable, not less. In the months that followed, Prince Kelthus began taking on more public responsibilities. He attended council meetings where his unique perspective helped solve problems that had puzzled advisors for years. He visited distant worlds where his gentle manner and honest communication earned the respect of populations that had only known dragon rule through force and fear. Claire watched these developments with pride and amazement. The frightened, isolated young dragon she had first met was now becoming a leader who could bridge the gap between different species and different ways of thinking. But the greatest change was in Emperor Zethkalar himself. The emperor had spent 2 years learning from Claire about patience, understanding, and the value of seeing the world through other people's eyes. He discovered that ruling through fear and dominance was far less effective than ruling through wisdom and cooperation. He began visiting the worlds of his empire not as a conqueror reviewing his possessions, but as a leader trying to understand the needs of his people. He met with representatives from every species under dragon rule, listening to their concerns and their ideas for improvement. Many of these conversations led to significant changes in imperial policy. Worlds that had been strip-mined for resources were given assistance to develop sustainable industries. Species that had been forced to abandon their cultures were encouraged to preserve and share their traditions. Educational systems were reformed to accommodate different learning styles, not just those that worked for dragons. The empire became stronger as it became more diverse. Scientific research accelerated when dragon scholars began collaborating with experts from other species. Military effectiveness improved when commanders learned to value different tactical approaches. Economic growth increased when trade policies were designed to benefit all participants, not just dragons. 5 years after Claire first entered Prince Kelth's tower as a servant, she stood beside him on the balcony of the Imperial Palace, watching ships from dozens of different worlds arrive for the first Galactic Council of Equals. Did you ever imagine it would change this much? Prince Kelth's